Welcome. Can anybody hear that, I hope? Okay. This is the day after Charles Darwin's 204th birthday. And today I get the pleasure of introducing Dr. Eugenie Scott, who's the executive director of the National Center for Science Education. She's been doing that since, I think, 1987 now. She has a PhD in physical anthropology from over at the University of Missouri, where there's currently in the House and the legislature of the Missouri state a bill that mandates the teaching of intelligent design and redefines the nature of science, which will sort of be a segue into what we're going to hear from Dr. Scott today, which is Creationism du jour. I also want to urge everybody to stay around afterwards. There'll be some time for questions, and Dr. Scott will be giving a big public lecture this evening over in Ballroom D in the Student Center that everybody's very welcome to attend as well. And I think since we're already running a little late, we'll start. Dr. Scott.
Well, we're not too late. We're just a couple of minutes late. So actually that's pretty good considering the rather having to call in two cavalries to get the computers going here, but that's fine. Well, thank you very much. It's lovely to be here. Now, creationism du jour implies that there's something new about creationism, and in some sense there is. Basically, the history of anti-evolutionism in the United States can be looked at as a series of efforts by creationists to get evolution out of the classroom or some form of creationism into the classroom in order to balance the teaching of evolution, something they disagree with. And they very strongly, of course, disagree with evolution. I want to remind you that when we're talking about evolution, we're talking about a concept that goes well beyond the man evolved from monkeys kind of idea that's so common in the general public, but it's really a general principle that cuts across all science. What evolution really refers to is the radical idea that the universe has had a history, that galaxies and stars have cumulatively changed over time, that the planet Earth has cumulatively changed over time, that organisms, plants and animals on the Earth have cumulatively changed over time, and that human cultures have cumulatively changed over time. The past is different from the present. There has been this cumulative change. And therefore, astronomy, geology, biology, and anthropology are all evolutionary sciences. Now, creationists object to all of them. They object to cosmology, they object to biological evolution, they certainly object to human evolution. With biological evolution, which is what I'm mostly going to concentrate on today, we have the added inference that living things have common ancestors, that something called descent with modification has taken place. Now, if you ask people, what is evolution? You get this idea, of course, that man evolved from monkeys. This is something that we seem to be fairly hardwired for here in the United States as a definition. Now, you can hardly find 4 words with a larger assemblage of error than those 4 words. Man evolved from monkeys. Hint, that is not a man. Clearly, females have to evolve too, and that's kind of across the board, but, language notwithstanding. And that's not a monkey, okay? This is a monkey. There's a big difference between monkeys and apes, and actually the relationship evolutionarily between humans, monkeys, and apes is like this. Humans are much more closely related to apes than they are to monkeys. Humans and apes shared a common ancestor. Human apes and monkeys shared a common ancestor much further ago in time. And that's really what evolution is biological evolution is about. It's about the idea of common ancestry of living things, not just about humans. I could draw a barnacle tree just like that, and we could look at the closest related barnacles and then the further, more distantly related barnacles and go till it's barnacles all the way down, as Charles Darwin would probably say. So Common ancestry is the big idea of evolution, and we study evolution by looking at the patterns of evolution, how do the tree of life branch through time, and by looking at the processes and the mechanisms of evolution. And all three of those are sort of independent areas of study, which are fascinating to talk about, but I'm not going to talk about them today. I'm going to talk about the people who don't like evolution. Can you all hear me all right, by the way? Good, thank you. If people in the back row are nodding, I know it must be okay. So the creationism and evolution controversy is about people who don't like evolution being taught to their kids. They would prefer if some form of creationism be taught. So when laws were passed requiring excuse me, I'm on the wrong slide here, pardon me. The First Amendment of the I'm doing two different screens here, so pardon me if I lose track of where I am at some point. There were different slides showing on both. I knew I was wrong. The First Amendment of the Constitution says that government has to be religiously neutral in public institutions, and schools are public institutions, therefore schools have to be religiously neutral. They can neither promote nor denigrate religion. They can neither advance nor inhibit religion. That is what the courts have held. Just to refresh your memory about the religion clause in the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, when you take them together, mean that public institutions have to be neutral. Establishment Clause has to do with the establishment of religion. Free exercise has to do with the ability to practice one's religion. So schools have to be religiously neutral. So when laws were passed requiring that creationism be taught, well, very, very quickly they were struck down. Then something called creation science was invented. This was the idea that you could take what was basically a literal interpretation of the Bible, special creation, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and find scientific warrant for it. Well, the courts decided that that was unconstitutional. Creation science might be called science, but it really was a religious idea that was being passed off as science. It did not have scientific merit, and therefore it was unconstitutional to be taught. Not too long thereafter, something called intelligent design was proposed as something that could balance the teaching of evolution. The courts, one court, the Middle District of Pennsylvania, in the federal district court, Kitzmiller versus Dover, decided that intelligent design was also a religious idea masquerading as science, and that to teach it in the public schools would be religious advocacy. So therefore, intelligent design also was unconstitutional to teach. Well, what's the creationism du jour? The creationism du jour is something called evidence against evolution. And this hasn't been tested in the courts yet. So we're at the stage now where we're still feeling our way around what is legal and what is not legal. I have reasons for believing that the evidence against evolution approach, because it can clearly be tied in with intelligent design and creation science and then straight up creationism, and because the laws that are proposed to advance the teaching of the evidence against evolution really do come from the same history, which I'll try to outline briefly for you this afternoon. I have a feeling that these probably won't stand legal muster in the United States either, but this all remains to be seen. Now, where does this idea of evidence against evolution come from? Well, it comes from a very long-standing meme, M-E-M-E, term referring to a cultural idea that waxes and wanes and is perhaps selected for or against. You know, like wearing your baseball cap backwards, like that gentleman there, or wearing your baseball cap forward, like that gentleman there. Those are memes. Okay. At any rate, a long-standing meme in the creationism community is something called the two-model approach. This is their term for it. They believe that there are only two possibilities. There's either evolution or there is biblical special creationism. Either evolution happened or God specially created all of the organisms, the planet, the galaxies, the stars, etc. Those are the only two possibilities. Therefore, goes the belief, if you disprove evolution, well, what's left? Creationism wins by default. So their belief is that evidence against evolution is evidence for creationism, and you'll find this phrase very commonly in the creationist literature. Now, of course, the logic here isn't very good, because the problem is over there on that biblical special creationism side. Now, there's really only one concept of evolution, biological evolution. Living things have common ancestors. And we can argue about how the tree of life branches. We can argue about how important is natural selection versus evo-devo or some other factors that affect evolution. But really, the big idea is living things have common ancestors. Full stop. So there aren't really any alternatives over there on the evolution side. There's a lot of alternatives over there on the creationism side. For instance, if you went to Catholic school, you were taught something called theistic evolution. A theistic evolution is the idea that evolution happened, living things have common ancestors, humans shared common ancestors with apes, and barnacles shared common ancestors with whatever barnacles share common ancestors with. I don't know much about invertebrates. Sorry, I'm a vertebrate kind of girl. Evolution happened, but this was part of God's plan. And there's all kinds of different theological statements of theistic evolution. There's a whole taxonomy, as it were, within the theological community of what theistic evolution means. But clearly, if you disprove evolution, you haven't proven theistic evolution. You haven't proven biblical special creationism. Which one have you proven? Well, you haven't proven any, because the logic doesn't work. There's two possibilities over there. But you know, there's no reason for us just to stick to Christianity. There are plenty of world religions that, there are ancient religions that are no longer practiced by anybody anymore, and there's lots and lots of tribal religions around the planet. None of these are proven if you disprove evolution. So the whole idea of teach both, with the implication that you teach evolution and then creationism, falls apart very swiftly because of all of the other options over there on the creationist side. So evidence against evolution really isn't evidence for creationism, but they believe this very, very strongly. And they are quite convinced that this is the new approach that should be taken in combating the teaching of evolution in the public schools. I mentioned that when creation science was proposed, there was a lawsuit that struck down or that declared the teaching of creation science to be unconstitutional. Right after that lawsuit was settled, the Institute for Creation Research declared that teachers should really teach the evidence against evolution. Quote, teachers should be encouraged to stress the scientific evidences and arguments against evolution in their classes, not just arguments against some proposed evolutionary mechanism, but against evolution per se, even if they don't wish to recognize these as evidences and arguments for creation. So evidence against evolution is evidence for creationism. This is a way of bringing creationism in by the back door. This, of course, is our old friend, the two-model approach, right? Evidence against evolution is evidence for special creationism. Well, is this really bringing in creationism by the back door? We don't know for sure, but there certainly is reason to believe that a lot of students feel similarly think in this dichotomous fashion. We don't expect high school students to have a very sophisticated understanding of Christian theology or any other kind of theology, after all. And I have a feeling that it's not uncommon that if you say to a kid, well, evolution didn't happen, fairly quickly that kid might just devolve to, oh, well, then it must be special creationism. And there are no proper data on this from a sociological standpoint, but there's some interesting suggestions for why this might possibly be the case. A number of years ago in California, in the small community of El Cajon, there was a controversy over the teaching of evidence against evolution in an intersession course, and CNN interviewed some students about their experience in taking the course. And I apologize for giving you all this stuff to read, because I have firm beliefs about PowerPoint, and that they are that you should never have more than about 6 words on a slide if you could help it. Right, children? Yes, we don't want to. Don't clutter up your slide with your whole talk, right? And I'm going to look really awful there, because I'm going like this in that last picture. So the CNN reporter says, what have you learned? the student says, I've learned that evolution has become, over the years, more and more people decide it's not completely true and that there has to be another belief or another thing that replaces it. And what is that? That's the intelligent designer. God? Yes, the Christian God who created Earth in 6 days. Now, if you know anything about intelligent design, this would make the people up in the Discovery Institute just go into a frenzy, because the last thing they want to be compared to is the six-day creationist. But people lump, intelligent design, six-day creationism, it's all the same to most people. Now, we don't know whether across the board students will devolve into this attitude, but certainly there's anecdotal data. Not just this, but just, if you talk to kids. I suspect that this kind of dichotomous thinking is not uncommon. If you contend that evolution is weak or unsubstantiated science, students will often conclude that special creationism is therefore true. And that is the main characteristic of academic freedom laws, which is the topic of my talk today. We've had a fair amount of academic freedom, of anti-evolution legislation in 2013. It's only February. It's only been a month and a half. The legislative season is young. There may be more. But we've had quite a number of bills, and those marked with an asterisk are of the kind that we call the Academic, or that they call the Academic Freedom Act. So this does appear to be the creationism du jour. So what are these bills like? Well, the first Academic Freedom Act was filed in Alabama in 2004, and it was intended to allow teachers to teach evolution, but then to also teach alternative views to evolution. What is an alternative view to evolution? Well, the sponsor of the bill, Representative Jim Carnes, was quoted, "Evolution is one theory, creation is an alternate theory." So this was a bill that was intended to bring creationism into the school without calling it creationism. There had by that time, of course, been the Supreme Court case saying you can't teach creation science. So it was clear that any requirement that you had for teaching anything with the C word in it, creationism, creation science, wasn't going to fly. So alternative theories was the euphemism of choice here. Well, the bill got out of committee, but it didn't get through the House before the legislature adjourned, and so the Alabama bill never went anyplace. But one of the interesting provisions of the Alabama bill that we've seen often from time to time is that it was protective of teachers. If a teacher was teaching alternative theories, the bill said that the school district, the superintendent or the principal, the administrators, the Board of Education, whoever, were constrained from disciplining the teacher, from telling the teacher to knock it off. It was, intended to be sort of a, you can go ahead and violate the First Amendment kind of a dog whistle. Why have this curious protective provision here? My hypothesis is that the author of the bill might have been thinking of a series of cases that were decided in the early 2000s, in the 1990s and early 2000s, where teachers basically freelance. They weren't told by their districts to teach creationism, but they went ahead and taught it on their own. In each of these three cases, the school district said, don't do that. Stop teaching. Teacher said, no, this is my free speech, my academic freedom right to teach what I think is good science, so I'm going to go ahead and teach it. And the teachers sued the district for their right to do this. In every single case, the district court judges, or in the case of LeVake, a state court judge, said, no, teachers, K-12 teachers, you really don't have academic freedom like universities have. A K-12 teacher has hardly any academic freedom. You have to, if you sign a contract in a school district, you have agreed to teach that district's curriculum. Do what they tell you. And this may seem kind of harsh to those of us from the university who think academic freedom is very important, and academic freedom is worth cherishing, certainly. But think about it from the standpoint of a large school system with tens and sometimes even hundreds of thousands of students in it. You want the kids in this fourth grade class being taught the same thing as the kids in that fourth grade class, because when they go to fifth grade, they all have to know the same stuff. So you can't have teachers just willy-nilly teaching anything they want. They need to teach the curriculum. The courts held that the districts have an interest, to use a legal term. Districts have an interest in seeing that the curriculum is followed. When a teacher goes way off the reservation and starts teaching something that is really quite at variance with the curriculum, much less something that is in contradiction to what everybody else is teaching, that the district has a right to kind of ride herd on that person and bring them around. Now, I suspect that it was thinking about depending on what survey research you look at, up to 25, maybe few more percentages of teachers who would like to bring creationism into the classroom, unfortunately, that the framers of this Alabama bill and its descendants wanted to put a protective clause in just to encourage teachers to go ahead and teach these materials if they wanted to. And we've tracked over 40 of these academic freedom type bills since 2004. Now, obviously, I can't cram them all on this slide, and this is only a partial list. Only 2 of these bills have passed, fortunately, which isn't too bad a ratio, but obviously we'd be much happier if none of them passed. By the way, there's very good reasons why these bills don't pass. And the major reason is that citizens, like you, and like your parents, or like your children, will go to the mailboxes and go to the telephones and go to the email and sometimes even go to the committee meetings of the legislative bodies and express their views to their legislators, express their views to the committees as to why these bills are very poor educational policy and, frankly, are rewarmed creationism and therefore in violation of the neutrality that we expect from public schools. We don't really want to have people's religion being presented in the classroom because it's might not be your religion. So we really want to have a religiously neutral classroom. Now, these bills vary somewhat, but all of them reflect the idea that there is academic freedom involved in the teaching of science. In 2008, Louisiana passed the Louisiana Science Education Act, which originated as the Louisiana Academic Freedom Act, but it was renamed during the somewhat extended course of its debate and passage. The original version of the bill had some very clever components. Courts previously had said that singling out evolution for special treatment was evidence for having a religious purpose, so the original bill bundled evolution, origin of life, global warming, and human cloning. Now, not a whole lot is taught about origin of life in the middle school and high school curriculum. Not much at all. You might have a picture of the Miller-Urey experiment just sort of in passing. Unfortunately, not very much is taught about global warming, although hopefully with the next generation science standards, that's going to change. I assure you, high school kids are not doing labs on human cloning, okay? This is not a problem in the curriculum. But these are 4 topics that the religious right is very exercised about, and so these topics tend to show up in a number of these academic freedom bills. Now, the bill said that administrators could not discipline teachers for teaching the, quote, strengths and weaknesses of evolution and these other topics, which, you know, the fact that evolution is bundled with other subjects sounds like an effort to circumvent the First Amendment. The original bill also restricted administrators from censoring, as they put it, or prohibiting the use of any instructional materials that presented critiques of these subjects, which certainly would have benefited the Discovery Institute, which conveniently published a book exactly for the purposes of presenting the alleged weaknesses of evolution. And it was not a surprise that the Discovery Institute was very enthusiastic for the Louisiana bill. Now, the bill was also clever in that it was permissive rather than directive. It didn't say that teachers should do or shall do A, B, and C. It said teachers can do A, B, and C. This is very useful for legal purposes because it makes it much more difficult to challenge a bill that's permissive than a bill that on its face is directly and obviously unconstitutional. You can go to a judge with a bill that clearly looks on its face to be unconstitutional and say, Judge, this is a bad bill, we need an injunction, we need a trial, let's do it. And the judge will say, yep, this bill is a bad bill, let's, there's a question as to whether this is a bill, let's have a trial. If you have a bill that's merely permissive, that says teachers can do this if they want to, they don't have to. A lot of judges will say, well, we don't know if this is a bad bill. It sounds kind of dumb, but we don't know if it's a bad bill. Let's just see how it works out. Lawyers referred to this as an as-applied challenge, as opposed to a facial challenge. So you have to actually find that teacher who's gone off the rails. You find the teacher who's bringing the creationism stuff into the classroom. Know how easy that is? That's not very easy. How many kids come home and say, guess what we learned in school today, Mom? You have no idea what goes on in your kid's classroom, most of us. So finding that teacher isn't very easy, particularly if it's a part of the country where maybe people think these ideas should be brought into the class anyway. Louisiana probably has a lot of parishes where that's the case. But wait, there's more. Not only do you have to find the teacher, then you have to find a plaintiff. You have to find someone with standing to sue, that's with standing, not withstanding, someone who has legal standing to bring lawsuit, which means either a student in the class or in the previous class who's going to be taking that teacher in the following year. I mean, lawsuits are not something you take on easily. They're a pain in the butt. You really don't want to do it if you can avoid it. We certainly avoid it as much as we can. And then that person has to be willing to be a plaintiff, and it's not easy to be a plaintiff. It's a very brave thing for you to sort of stand out in your community like that. So there's a lot of barriers ahead of somebody who wants to challenge a law that is only permissive. So I don't think that it was accidental that these academic freedom laws tend to be permissive. And the Louisiana bill also had a disclaimer stating that, quote, nothing in the bill should be construed as promoting religion. Nobody here but a scientist. Now, after a protracted struggle with a lot of behind-the-scenes works by our friends on the ground in Louisiana, who deserve a great deal of thanks, the final bill that was passed was better than the original bill, but still quite problematic. Essentially, it kicked the task upstairs where, upon request of school districts, the State Department of Education was to, quote, foster an environment within public elementary and secondary schools that promotes critical thinking skills, logical analysis, and open and objective discussion of scientific theories, including, of course, evolution, the origin of life, global warming, and human cloning. Now, of course, if this were really a critical thinking bill, right, why would you single out just science, number one? Actually, some of the best critical thinking instruction in high school goes on in the English class, where you're being taught how to analyze rhetoric. What's an assertion? What is an unfounded statement? English teachers do this kind of stuff all the time. It's not like it happens only in science class. And even if you were going to restrict this only to science class, well, why would you highlight these topics? Well, because these topics are the ones that people get their knickers in a bunch about, and this is why we've had this conversation or conflagration about creation and evolution for so many decades here. The Louisiana bill is, alas, again, a permissive bill, not requiring the teaching of anything, but blowing that dog whistle to creationists that if you want to do this, you can do this. The protective component, fortunately, was dropped, which was much to the relief of administrators who lobbied very strongly against protecting teachers or students from bringing in just any old thing that they wanted, because administrators were very concerned that they would not be able to avoid lawsuits in the future. Now, meanwhile, our friends at the Discovery Institute had come out with the Model Academic Freedom Act in 2007 and claimed to have presented it in many states. The Discovery Institute has long promoted a view that there is great persecution of proponents of intelligent design and that some sort of legal protection is needed. This is the view that is at the heart of the movie Expelled, which some of you might have made the mistake of seeing. This was an did anybody see Expelled here? Oh, the true creation and evolution nerds, I can tell. This was a movie that came out in 2008 starring actor Ben Stein. It claimed that there was a Darwinist conspiracy of scientists trying to keep the intelligent design movement suppressed. And everyone on the evolution side who was interviewed for the movie was interviewed under false pretenses, I hasten to add, including me. They told us all that this was just sort of a generic, vague movie about the creation and evolution controversy, and yeah, I do interviews on that. That's no big deal. We didn't know that this was going to turn out to be a movie that accused, in all seriousness, that accused the whole scientific community of lying and promoting racism and just a whole laundry list of really quite offensive things. Another person who was in this movie was the blogger P.Z. Myers. There's kind of a funny story about this, about Expelled. Before they launched the film, they had a series of previews where they would go around the country, and you could sign up online. I tried to sign up. I didn't get on. They didn't send me a ticket, but you could sign up online, and you'd fill out a form, and they'd send you a ticket, and you could go to a preview. This is before they had the big launch. So that's fine. And P.Z. Myers, who's a very well-known science blogger up in Morris, Minnesota, noticed that there was going to be a showing of Expelled in Minneapolis, which is a couple hours' drive from Morris. So he decided to make the pilgrimage, and he signed up online, using his own name, of course. P.Z. is in the movie, by the way, as am I. And he was allowed to bring guests, so he said he would be bringing guests, and he brought his wife and his daughter and his daughter's boyfriend, and he had another guest. And when they showed up, they all signed in, they showed their identification, his wife's boyfriend, the daughter and the friend, and they all showed their identification, and everything was fine. And yeah, it's going, it's going. And they were standing in line waiting to go in the auditorium, and one of the security people hustled over and hauled PZ out of line. He was not going to be allowed to see it. He was expelled from Expelled. And he said, well, can my guests go in? No, they can go in. So they let in his guests. They let in his guests. They let in his wife. They let in his daughter. They let in his daughter's boyfriend and his other guest, who just happened to be visiting from out of town. The chuckle that you heard was the biology department en masse. This is Richard Dawkins, the very famous evolutionary biologist who is a featured player in Expelled. If you see this movie, you will notice that they shot Richard in very dark shadow. I'm cheerful, but Richard, they've really made him look. Richard III did nothing on this. They really made him look quite diabolical. And of course, he would, my hypothesis, the reason why they lied to all of us is so that we wouldn't know this was a creationist movie because they wanted Richard. And if Richard knew this was a creationist movie, he doesn't play. I mean, I'll do this, it's part of my job. But he, completely refuses to cooperate with creationists for movies like this because he's been taken out of context a few times. So imagine their surprise when during the question and answer period, Richard stands up and asks a question. That was quite interesting. But anyway, Expelled does have it definitely has its shortcomings in more than one ways, but it certainly does express the idea of the Discovery Institute. There is this great conspiracy against intelligent design proponents, particularly at the university level. And the movie discusses a number of cases where the Discovery Institute, at any rate, has presented as examples of this kind of discrimination. Guillermo Gonzalez was denied tenure at the University of Iowa, allegedly because he wrote an intelligent design book. A little more complicated than that. If you look at his research productivity in his postdocs before he came to Iowa, it's pretty darn good. And then when you look at his productivity after he got to Iowa, it's not so good. Iowa's going to give him tenure based on what he did at Iowa. That's the way the game is played. So there's a perfectly good argument that it wasn't because of his ties with intelligent design. He was not judged by the Iowa faculty to be sufficiently productive to have tenure at a Big Ten university. Richard von Sternberg published an intelligent design article in a small museum journal he was editing, The Proceedings of the Biological Society of Washington, which raised quite a firestorm. When other editors took a look at it, they decided that it was inappropriate for the journal. It had science in it that was simply not acceptable to other scientists. It had some kind of bizarre stuff about how the Cambrian explosion is a big problem for evolution, which would come very much as a surprise to the scientists working at the Smithsonian. At any rate, he didn't lose his job, he didn't lose any money, he wasn't working for the Smithsonian. People just said mean things about him. Oh my, he must never have been on the internet before. And Carolyn Crocker is another alleged victim of the Darwinist conspiracy. She's a woman who has been teaching as contingent faculty at a number of universities and community colleges in the Washington, D.C. area. I think anybody who understands the academia these days realizes that the contingent faculty way of life is highly exploitative. Universities should be ashamed for exploiting faculty like this. You have a one-year contract, and then you're disposable, and you have to find another job the next year. And she, was not retained in the several institutions at which she was teaching. I have great sympathy for people trying to be academics in that kind of a setting, but to ascribe her inability to maintain jobs as a contingent faculty member to her intelligent design support may be overstating the case. At any rate, at the time that Expelled was released in 2008, my organization, the National Center for Science Education, published a website, expelledexposed.com, that analyzed the movie, including the claims of the persecuted intelligent design supporters. And if you go to the Truth Behind the Fiction section of our website, you will find a great deal of information on Gonzalez, Crocker, and all the rest of them. So I do encourage you to take a look at it. The truth is much less drastic than presented in the movie. In general, when people don't get tenure or don't get rehired, it's not because of their ID activities, but because their work was not considered suitable or high enough quality. So because of their belief that teachers and professors need to be protected so that they can teach intelligent design, in the Discovery Institute's Model Academic Freedom Act, they stress protecting the expelled. Teachers, including university professors, may, quote, present scientific information pertaining to the full range of scientific views regarding biological and chemical evolution. Full range of scientific views is a very interesting little phrase. It comes directly from wording proposed by Senator Rick Santorum for the No Child Left Behind Act in 2001. The Santorum Amendment, as it was called, it was really a resolution, not an amendment, was not included in No Child Left Behind. It did call originally for the full range of scientific views to be taught about evolution. It ended up as basically a footnote in the conference committee report, not as part of the law. So it's basically not terribly important unless somebody takes No Child Left Behind to court, which they're not going to. In which case the conference committee report would be used to inform the judge as to the sense of the Congress at the time the bill was passed. It's immaterial to the bill. But creationists have used that full range of scientific views wording ever since to claim that the federal government requires the teaching of evidence against evolution. So it's not exactly the way things work out. The Discovery Institute model is protective of teachers and schools, protective of teachers and students. It protects teachers against loss of tenure and prevents disciplinary action against them should they hold to a, quote, particular position on evolution. In other words, if you propose intelligent design, you can't be fired. Now, all this sounds perfectly reasonable. Now, why wouldn't you have academic freedom to propose ideas? And yeah, at the university level you do. Any of your professors can propose intelligent design. The problem is that what happens at the university level is that in science classes we actually do promote those scientific ideas that help explain the natural world. And if you examine intelligent design does not help us explain the natural world. And so that is why university scientists don't use it in their work. The burden of proof, if you will, is on the proponents of intelligent design to demonstrate to the scientific community that their ideas work. Thus far, they haven't done so. So they're not being taught at the university level. Now, if they're not being taught at the university level, much less should they be imposed at the high school level, where they are clearly outside of the scientific consensus, and you would truly be miseducating students as to what scientists hold on these various ideas. In 2008, the Discovery Institute and its model bill strongly influenced a bill proposed by Florida State Senator Rhonda Storms. Ms. Storms introduced her version of the Academic Freedom Act during the 2008 legislative session, which, as proposed in the Discovery Institute model legislation, gave teachers the right to teach the full range of views, Code for Evidence Against Evolution and Creationism. It prohibited administrators from cracking down on teachers who teach bad science. It left the door open for students to promote creationist views in the classrooms and in their assignments. And thanks to a very heroic, as well as some really good luck, the bill didn't pass. It basically got through one house, it almost got out of the second house, and then the clock ran out on the legislative session, and it never was instituted. But if you compare the House and the Senate versions of the Florida Act with the Discovery Institute bill, the letters of which are indicated in red, you can see that the similarities are very clear. The Discovery Institute bill was very influential in Florida. Now, there were, of course, several new academic freedom acts proposed in several states between 2008 and 2012. Fortunately, all of them died in committee or were otherwise not passed. Then in the spring of last year, 2012, Tennessee State Senator Bo Watson pushed through a bill called the Tennessee Academic Freedom Act, and the second of these kinds of bills became law. Mr. Watson's bill was a pretty standard AFA bill. It called for students to explore scientific questions, learn about scientific evidence, develop critical thinking skills, and respond appropriately and respectfully to differences of opinion about scientific subjects. Sounds good. But like the original Louisiana bill and the original Alabama bill, it stated that neither the state board nor any other administrative unit could prohibit a teacher from helping students understand, analyze, critique, and review the strengths and weaknesses of existing scientific theories. And guess which theories they had in mind? Evolution, origin of life, global warming, and human cloning. We're getting a pattern here. The similarities between the Tennessee and the Louisiana bills are very clear. Both of them bundle evolution, origin of life, global warming, and cloning. Both of them are couched in terms of critical thinking. Excuse me. Both encourage teachers to critique evolution and other subjects. Both have an obligatory statement that they're not intended to promote religion, ducking the First Amendment as How many bills passed in the state legislature? This is a bill about the importance of putting a new freeway interchange ramp on Highway 70, but it's not intended to promote religion. I mean, how many bills do you get proposed that have this little codicil about nobody here but a secularist? It's a little curious. The Tennessee bill, unlike the Louisiana bill, is also protective of students. Now, I suspect that these provisions are going to crop up elsewhere, and I think this Louisiana-Tennessee combination is very likely to be what we will be seeing in the future. I have for you a phylogeny, stopping with the Oligocene when discussing mammal evolution, but we haven't really had any time to update it. And besides, like mammals in the Oligocene, the basic patterns have been established, and there's not a lot that's new. So basically, there's two major strands of academic freedom acts, the first one beginning here in Alabama in 2004. This bill protected the rights of students and teachers to express their views, protected them from being disciplined by administrators, and was also worded in terms of teachers being able to teach alternative theories. Now, the bill was critiqued by the Discovery Institute. that brought in its own modifications, being more legally savvy. It got them to drop the alternative theories explanation because that smacks too much like wording used in the creationism bills that preceded it. And they substituted the full range of scientific views language from the No Child Left Behind Santorum Amendment. Now, of course, the original full range of scientific views in the minds of creationists included creation science and ideas, so there wasn't a great loss there. The Discovery Institute's own modified bill came in 2008 and has been influential ever since. This tree represents another strain of academic freedom acts, originating from a 2006 policy passed in Ouachita Parish, Louisiana, which was promoted by the Louisiana Family Forum, which is a having trouble talking now, conservative Christian organization that is affiliated with Focus on the Family. It bundled evolution with other religious right concerns like origin of life, global warming, and cloning, used the strengths and weaknesses language brought up from Texas and elsewhere. And the Louisiana Scientific Education Act, passed a couple of years later, was introduced by the father of the Ouachita Parish Bill when he was elected to the State House of Representatives. Again, couched in terms of critical thinking of students, critical analysis of scientific theories and so forth, but also protective. And it added the provision that administrators can't censor materials. Now, two strains, as in horizontal gene transfer, have influenced one another. And although the Louisiana bill originally was inspired by Ouachita Parish regulation, its descendants have been influenced by the Discovery Institute model bill, and the Discovery Institute, of course, modified the Alabama bill. Academic freedom for teachers runs through both sides, but like jumping genes, provisions like whether teachers are protected for teaching evidence against evolution or whether evolution is bundled with other subjects can hop back and forth. Generally speaking, though, the lineage to the left uses language like full range of scientific views and focuses on a teacher's freedom of expression. On the right, you get language like strengths and weaknesses, critical analysis, and so forth. And it also includes bundling global warming, stem cell, origin of life, cloning, etc. By the way, when you hear critical analysis in these bills, it doesn't mean critical analysis. When all of these bills call for critical analysis, but when you actually talk to the legislators who propose the bills, by critical analysis they mean criticize. Okay. Critical analysis of evolution means criticize evolution. It doesn't actually mean critical analysis as we think of this term. A bill that did not pass in Kentucky in 2011 might be a model for future academic freedom-type bills. HB 169, interestingly enough, doesn't mention evolution or any other subject by name. Like the Louisiana statute, it directs administrators to foster an environment for critical thinking. And also, like Louisiana, it allowed teachers to bring in outside materials to supplement the curriculum approved by the district. Again, like Louisiana, it called for critique and review of scientific theories. In a way, not mentioning evolution at all, but using all the rest of the language is even more subtle and perhaps even more recognizable by creationist teachers. But now there's a bill that's been introduced just last month in Indiana by Representative Jeff Thompson. HB 1283 in most ways is a very typical academic freedom bill. It calls for students to understand, analyze, critique, and review, et cetera, the strengths and weakness of conclusions and theories, and there you go. Please note that, as I say, critique and critical analysis get translated as criticized. This is a strengths and weaknesses bill. It's permissive, it is protective, and again has the little codicil about not to be construed as promoting any religious or non-religious doctrine. Unlike most other academic freedom acts, it's not labeled as an AFA. And interestingly enough, it doesn't mention evolution, global warming, or the other supposedly controversial issues. Instead, like the Kentucky bill of 2011, it's much more vague, just noting that topics in science, history, and health have produced different conclusions and theories on some topics. Well, science is clear. That's evolution, origin of life, global warming, right? History, that's curious. But if you remember a couple of years ago, when Texas had a big fight over its science, over its history and social studies standards. There were issues brought up by the conservatives on the State Board of Education there, promoting the idea that America's a Christian nation, and the founding fathers were all evangelical Christians, which would come as a big surprise to all the deists who were the founding fathers. And taking, you remember, taking Thomas Jefferson out of the Enlightenment, stuff like that. So these kinds of issues may be, again, dog whistles to religious conservatives who want to bring these things in. And why health? Well, possibly this is where the stem cells could come in and the cloning kind of stuff. So this is a way of getting to those same issues without necessarily mentioning them by name. But the rest of the language tracks very closely the Louisiana and Tennessee bills that have passed. Well, what should we expect? Well, in Indiana, the bill hasn't been scheduled yet, and according to the chair of the House Education Committee, it's not likely to. This will be very good news for Indiana teachers. We can only hope. Well, let's recap the academic freedom bills, the creationism du jour, if you will. From a legal standpoint, they tend to be very vaguely written. They're not specific about creationism and religion, but there's plenty of hints as to what the goals are if you understand the history of these bills, which is why I've gone into so much detail about the history. And there's more history. They express very popular themes: academic freedom, freedom of speech. These are themes that are very difficult to oppose because they resonate very strongly with American culture. And I'm all for free speech, believe me. And finally, they encourage creationist teachers by promising them protection if they go off the rails. It's kind of a get-out-of-jail-free card, if you will, to a creationist teacher. Now, either creationist teachers will be encouraged to bring this material into the classroom. Minimally, teachers will be encouraged to bring in a lot of really bad creationist science. And that isn't very good for science literacy either. So schematically, what we have here is creation science was struck down by the courts. Not very long thereafter, intelligent design was developed. Intelligent design was also struck down by the courts. In this post-Edwards versus Aguillard, which was the case that struck down creation science, and post-Kitzmiller versus Dover, the case that struck down intelligent design as being constitutional, we've had basically two directions, shall we say. Teach the weaknesses of evolution, the evidence against evolution, alternatively teach the full range of views. If you go to the science faculty here and say, can you please give me the full range of view on evolution? And they'll say, evolution. The full range of views is living things have common ancestor, the planet's really old, the universe is really old, galaxies evolved, living things evolved. That's the full range of views. Now we argue about the details. If you go to the people who propose these, the teachers teach the full range of views and say, where do I find information on the full range of views? Interestingly enough, you are directed right back to the intelligent design and creation science literature. You do not find the full range of views as they interpret it, which means, of course, creationism, evidence against evolution, and stuff like that, in the science literature. Similarly, if you go to your science faculty here or elsewhere and say, if you're a teacher, I need to teach on Monday morning the weaknesses of evolution, where's the list? They won't quite know how to handle this because they can't just open their drawer and pull out the list of weaknesses of evolution. There isn't any. All of the evidence that we have is compatible with the inference that living things share common ancestors. That's the way it works. If you ask the proposers of these bills, where will I find the evidence against evolution? Guess where you'll be sent? You will be sent to the creationist literature. So the problem is twofold, as I say. In summary, teachers will either use these types of law to justify bringing in creationism, which is a very bad idea for both American science literacy as well as what I hope is a healthy respect for the religious neutrality of schools and the importance of the establishment and free exercise clauses, or they may use these laws to justify denigrating evolution, which is kind of like denigrating heliocentrism. I mean, teachers should no more be teaching that evolution is shaky science any more than they should be teaching that heliocentrism, that planets go around the Earth, the planets go around the sun, is shaky science, and you don't have to believe it if you don't want to. But this is the kind of conundrum that teachers find themselves in. All right. It's probably safe to say that the National Center, and Explore Evolution is where you also will find these weaknesses of evolution. And guess who publishes that? The Discovery Institute. So the National Center for Science Education is going to have plenty to do in the future in coping with the creationism du jour. We're at ncse.com, so please check us out, and you'll find very interesting things on the website. Glenn Branch is my deputy director. Robert Lunn is our communications director. Peter Hess is our religious community outreach director. And our flare-ups wranglers, Josh Rosenau, Steve Newton, and Eric Mickle, who also doubles as our education director. And our two climate change specialists, Mark McCaffrey and Minda Berbecco, are the people who primarily handle the calls for desperate people who have elected the wrong school board and now wish for some advice on what to do about it. ncse.com. If you go to this button here, you can sign up for a free electronic newsletter that comes out on Friday, which is really informative and very depressing as to things that are going on in the creationism and evolution controversy. We have added climate change because global warming is added to these bills, right? And teachers are feeling the same kinds of pushback for teaching global warming as they have been receiving for teaching evolution. Just they've been getting it longer for evolution. Climate science is something newer. So we have some climate science resources for teachers and other people. If you go to the news page, this button here, this is especially important to students who may be looking for term paper topics. There's a lot of information on our news page. You can sort by state, you can sort by year, you can sort by all kinds of information here and really find out a lot about the creation and evolution controversy. And we are a membership organization, so obviously we would be very happy to have you join us as well. We are on YouTube, so check us out on YouTube. That's Steve Gould holding the world's best biological bumper sticker, if I do say so myself. Honk, if you understand punctuated equilibria. The people going are not biologists. And I'm even on Facebook. But if you do want to get my updates, if you would kindly like it, Eugenie.Scott. There's a number of other Eugenie Scott Facebook pages, but I don't update there. It's very flattering that people do that, but if you want to hear from me, I don't know why you would, but anyway, that's where you should go. So I have had great fun in my visits so far to SIU, and I thank you very much for inviting me to be part of your Darwin Day celebration this week. I'll be talking tonight on a very different topic. It won't be nearly this nerdy. It'll be much more fun. What did I call it? What would Darwin say to today's creationists? So I will give a little bit of history, and you will find out about Darwin's deathbed confessions. So join us tonight as well. And thanks so much for being such an attentive and interested audience.